your best boss ever? I've asked a lot of the people this question over the last few months, and I quickly noticed that in all their responses, most of them kept using the same word: care. A short little word that's tough to define. I don't know, people would say, she just cared about me. I was also shocked when people would say, I've never really had a good boss, but I'll tell you about a bad boss that I've had. And that's what I want to talk about today. I asked this question because I'm a boss myself. I'm a vice president at a fast-growing company here in Atlanta, and I think a lot about my leadership legacy. I often wonder if my employees feel that I really care about them. I wonder when they go home at night, what do they tell their spouses about me? And I wonder if I'll make the good boss list or the bad boss list. Bosses sometimes wonder these things. Today, I want to tell you the true story of the worst boss ever. A miserable, draconian leader from right here in the ATL. But first, I want to tell you about my neighborhood here in Atlanta. It's called Cabbage Town. That's right, got some Cabbage Town fans in the house. Near downtown, Cabbage Town is historically a poor, white, working class neighborhood. Today, it's the home of creatives, artists, and rebels. It's surrounded by history. From my rooftop, I can look west and see the gold dome of the state capitol building. If I glance east, I see Stone Mountain in the distance, the founding site of the second KKK. And in just a couple of blocks and a few minutes walk north, I can be at the birth home of Atlanta's favorite hero, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Cabbage Town is also pretty unique, and those of us who live there, we kind of love it. In Cabbage Town, people put candles on their porches at night, and they light them for no reason at all. In Cabbage Town, people put David Hasselhoff cutouts in their windows, also for no reason at all. In Cabbage Town, if you've got some art, you just put it out there, right? From big murals to poems taped to concrete poles to pop-up spray paint memorials in our very historic and famous Krog Tunnel. Cabbage Town is gritty, and this is a real hat, censored for your viewing pleasure. It's gritty, and it's also poopy. You don't move to Cabbage Town because it's nice. You move there because it's real. And at the center of the neighborhood stands the enormous Fulton Cotton Mill, a 135-year-old compound that was flipped by developers several years ago into residential lofts. I live there in Mill Number 1. It's the building at the bottom right of the screen. And most of the houses in Cabbage Town were built by the owners of the mill. They essentially set up a mill village to house all of their workers. The factory was abandoned in the late 1970s. The workers moved on, and a fence went up. Weather and weeds and rust did their thing. Around that time, an unknown vandal snuck onto the property and spray painted a mysterious message on the walls of the mill. The dark is near, the night is bold. There is no comfort when the soul grows cold. Everyone in Atlanta knew Cabbage Town for its big old abandoned mill. But what most people don't know is the story of what developers found when they began working their way through the property in the 1980s. Stepping over rotting wooden floors and old, rusted machinery, they came into the old administrative offices. They worked their way to the back and discovered a locked vault. They pried it open and discovered a massive collection of historical documents untouched since the mill shut down in the late 1970s. Knocking back the dust, they discovered blueprints, handwritten letters, newspaper clippings, and personnel files, all from the factory's 97-year history. This was Atlanta's version of King Tut's tomb. They phoned some researchers at Georgia Tech who hurried down there. The researchers figured out pretty quickly we're looking at something kind of special. And they knew that this historical collection of documents would forever change the way we viewed life in a southern textile mill. Countless untold stories emerged from these documents. However, One story was unlike all the others. The story of the cotton mill strike of 1914. And this is where we find our really bad boss. Meet Oscar Elsis. It's January of 1914, and Oscar has just taken over the company that his dad started, the Fulton Bag and Cotton Mill. His father, Jacob, was an orphaned immigrant who came to Atlanta after Reconstruction, after the Civil War. Jacob was an incredible entrepreneur, building his company into an industrial giant and employing over 1,000 people. Had there been a Fortune 500 back then, Fulton Bag and Cotton Mill would have been on it. But Oscar lacked the grit of his immigrant father. Oscar attended some of the finest schools in Europe. While he was away, his father was helping to start Georgia Tech. So he came back to Atlanta and became a part of Georgia Tech's first graduating class. Shortly after that, several years later, when Jacob retired, he tapped Oscar as his successor. This is a picture of the Fulton management team. Diversity was not their strong suit. You'll notice in the middle, that's Jacob, the elder entrepreneurial father. His son, Oscar, on the right. Oscar's body language here gives away a lot of things. Oscar lived a grand life. He rolled into the office every day in a black limousine driven by a personal chauffeur. His family lived in the luxury Ponce apartments. That may look familiar because it's still standing today, catty corner to the Fox Theater. They lived in these apartments with some of Atlanta's social elite, including John Candler, brother to Coca-Cola founder Asa Candler. Fancy galas were held on the roof, and I can often imagine Oscar standing with friends, looking to the south and proudly pointing to his smokestacks, symbols of his cotton mill empire. However, life underneath the stacks was anything but grand. The mill workers came from the rural Appalachians of northern Georgia. These were mountain people recruited to the city with the promise of high-paying jobs. Oscar could not relate at all with his people, nor did he try. He often called them the help. Once he referred to them as shiftless and irresponsible. He had nothing in common with his workers, so he didn't care to get to know them. Oscar employed the largest office staff of any mill in the South, and these people basically served as a buffer between he and his blue-collar workforce. Elsis built most of the homes in Cabbagetown. It wasn't called Cabbagetown back then, they just called it Factory Town. And around the time when he became president, the village was slipping into becoming a full-blown public health crisis. There was no trash collection in the village. There was no plumbing. The smell of feces filled the streets. Diseases like typhoid fever, malaria, tuberculosis, smallpox were extremely common in the overcrowded houses. One section of houses was known as Chinch Row because they were always crawling with bed bugs. Children as young as 6 were hooked on tobacco products. Under the cover of night, a horde of moonshiners and prostitutes slipped into the village to make money. Government inspectors visited the village quite often. They filed damning reports. Oscar wrote all of them off, basically blaming his hillbilly workforce for all of their own problems. It wasn't his problem, so he didn't care. And over time, a cottage industry of saloons, bars, and brothels cropped up along present-day Decatur Street, right next to the mill. The Fulton Bag and Cotton Mill had become the anchor of Atlanta's red light district, and its village people was its #1 client. Life inside the mill wasn't much better. Historian Gary Fink describes the facility as a fortress surrounded by a tall wall, studded at the top with spikes and broken glass. Most workers worked a 60-hour work week. That was the norm. Kept people on their feet for 11 hours at a time. Oscar's max lunch break was 30 minutes. He even commissioned the windows of the mill to be designed with smoked glass that would prevent people from looking outside and being distracted. Workers got sick a lot. Some said that working in the mill was like working in an oven. They reported chronic fatigue, migraine headaches, all kinds of health issues. Pay records show that workers in the card room, for example, made about $8 per week. When you adjust this for inflation and multiply it over the course of a year, your average Fulton cotton mill worker made the modern day equivalent of $9,000 a year, working 60 hours a week. But even that wasn't guaranteed due to Oscar's elaborate and complicated fining system. Oscar would fine you for anything: breaking company equipment, showing up to work late, taking an unauthorized water break. The only way you could earn back those fines is if you ratted out fellow employees for shoddy work. Oscar created a system that rewarded tattling. Over time, word began to spread, and Fulton Bag got the reputation as a hobo mill. How bad was it? Company records show that around this time, there were about 1,200 jobs in the mill. In 1910, over 10,000 different people worked in 1,200 jobs. If you're doing the math, that's a turnover of 800%. Perhaps Oscar's greatest shame lied in his use of child labor. This was the mill's dirty little secret. Company records show that about 12% of the workforce was between the ages of 10 and 16. One mom reported that her young daughter had breathing problems, constant headaches, and that the child walked with a stoop. By 1914, the situation had reached a boiling point. Unrest was growing amongst the mill workers. Labor activists in the North heard about it and quickly dispatched organizers to Atlanta who began recruiting workers to their cause. Finally, the decision was made, and on May the 20th, 1914, the first batch of workers walked away from their looms. A labor publication announced, "The first gun has been fired in Atlanta, and the campaign for the emancipation of the white slaves of the South is on." Oscar Elsis, needless to say, was not very happy. He moved quickly to crush the strike. Oscar kept an elaborate network of informants, workers paid to spy on his own people for just this occasion. He was prepared. However, he knew that he needed more spies, so he contracted with the Railway Audit and Inspection Company. This was basically a company that specialized in corporate espionage. So with this new batch of spies, he basically had eyes on everyone in Atlanta, eyes on his workers, eyes on the local police force, eyes on local religious leaders. Oscar even convinced the company doctor, a man whose job it was to care for the people, to spy on the people as he made house visits. Oscar had amassed an army of spies, and he was prepared for a war with his people. In all, 40 informants filed thousands of reports throughout the strike. However, none of them was more spectacular than operative number 115, Harry Preston. Fink describes him as one of the most, quote, remarkable undercover operatives in the history of American industrial relations. Harry Preston was a modern-day Jason Bourne. He spoke with a crisp English accent, used a fake name. He could perform any duty in the mill, and he had an amazing singing voice that he used to charm his way right into the middle of strike leadership. But at night, Preston snuck away, and by candlelight, he typed out a daily report feeding a constant stream of intel directly to, you guessed it, Oscar Elsis. Oscar's next move in his war against his people was evicting those who went on strike. On June the 4th, men charged in the village on horseback, evicting 218 men, women, and children, piling their belongings into the streets. Observers reported total chaos, with people crying in the streets, begging for mercy. It was quite the scene. And in the middle of it all was this woman, Ola Delight Smith. Women were still second-class citizens in Atlanta at the time, and Ola could have cared less. She was a labor activist hired to help organize union efforts, and she had little patience with the patriarchy. At one point, she actually punched a man with brass knuckles, and at other nights, she could be found getting extremely drunk with men in the bars. But Ola was ready on eviction day. She came into the streets with her camera, snapping pictures of weeping mothers and crying children. knowing exactly what would get sympathy from all of the locals. The strike continued into the summer with daily picket lines, and a commissary was set up to provide food for the strikers. This picture is awesome to me. I just want to give a quick shout out to the Coca-Cola marketing team. I mean, just killing it back in the day, 100 years ago. I mean, Atlanta's going to hell, but we have got our Coke, so it's all good. They continued to hold rallies throughout that summer down in the Oddfellows building on Auburn Avenue, also still standing today. They voiced their demands to Oscar Elsis, who completely ignored them. Oscar's position was that the majority of his workers were completely happy, and that therefore there was nothing to discuss. Behind the scenes, however, Oscar privately obsessed over the strike and its weekly meetings here in the Oddfellows building. So he hired an informant who specialized in electronic surveillance, and this is crazy. So one night this guy crawls into the ceiling of the auditorium of the Oddfellows building, and he hides a dictograph, which is basically an old school recording device. And this thing did its job. It provided a perfect transcript of every meeting the strikers had. Oscar now had an incredible strategic advantage over the strikers, and he was winning his war. Around that time, the strike became national news, so a federal investigator came down from Washington, D.C. to interview Elsis. Thinking he was speaking off the record, unbelievably, he told the investigator, "In an acute situation where I had only men to deal with, I'd just as soon get guns and mow them down." By August, local support for the strike was waning. Ola Delight and other leaders knew they had to do something to regain momentum. So they decided to build a tent city right next to the mill to house the workers. They knew this would provide a great visual to garner public support. The first big rain swamped the big city. Conditions deteriorated rapidly. Many strikers walked away. They knew they needed more public sympathy, so they hired a photographer who took these pictures. The photo here is actually quite interesting. Historians discovered years later this is a doctored photo. It's kind of obvious now, you can see the seam down the middle, but they didn't really have, they didn't have enough people to fill the photo, so they sort of stitched two photos together to create the impression that all of these poor Southern mill workers were out in the streets. By the beginning of 1915, the strike was losing steam. Harry Preston had fully infiltrated strike leadership. Some were calling for him to be made the president of the local union. Ola Delight Smith was accused of having an affair. She went to trial, went through a nasty divorce, and left town in disgrace. A judge ruled against her and barred her from remarrying. It was later discovered that Oscar Elsis's personal legal team helped her husband win his case against her. Demoralized, low on funds, and lacking local support, the strikers gave up. Nearly a year after it had won, the strike was over. Oscar Elsis had broken their will. He had won his war. I've never really had a bad boss like Oscar Elsis, but I've had a really good one. And as I read out, Oscar despised his people, disrespected their humanity. I was shocked that a company could be run this way. One of Atlanta's largest companies could be run by such a terrible person. And I was struck at how opposite this story was to my own, to my personal story of walking into an office every day for the last 11 years. And this is really what caused me to get obsessed with this story. It was totally a tale of two bosses, a stark contrast. My really good boss is this guy. His name is Chris. Like Oscar, Chris started or runs a company here in Atlanta just 100 years later. Chris started his company when he was in college. It's called Booster, and we raise funds for elementary schools through a fun run. When I was hired, there were just 3 of us. So we could fit the whole team at a booth in Applebee's with room to spare. And Chris is very excitable, and I remember back then when we were totally in startup phase and this thing was just a dream, I remember so clearly Chris saying, "Trap, man, we're gonna build a company totally different. We're gonna build a company that values people, that invests in people, that cares about people. And that's exactly what I've watched Chris do for 11 years. I've watched him lead with outrageous care. And listen, I get that every company says they care about their people, and that is not what I'm talking about. Outrageous care is wholly and completely different. For Chris, outrageous care means noticing the good things. Chris always notices when you've done something well. He will always point out your positive role in a project. Heck, when you walk into the office on a Monday morning wearing like a new shirt or new shoes, Chris is usually the first to notice that. Chris always notices. For Chris, outrageous care means an obsessive commitment to investing in people. Chris believes that we can all improve, we can all be better, and he puts his money where his mouth is. I have lost count of the number of conferences, books, special guest speakers, and leadership development programs that I've been a part of over the years. I've watched Chris show outrageous care by acting like a friend. Chris loves spending time with us. He remembers the names of our spouses and our children. He plays basketball with us and golf. He gets shirtless and invites us to work out with him. It's 5:15 in the morning. It's too early. Chris recently started a foundation designed for Boosters employees. Basically, when someone is going through a disaster or tragedy, there's a financial foundation in place that will help those folks out. Finally, for Chris, outrageous care means ridiculous joy. To this day, Chris is one of the most fun human beings I've ever met. He's the king of celebrations, whether it's personal or professional. Promotions, weddings, babies. Chris is always right in the middle. Chris has always felt way more like a friend to me than a boss. My favorite Chris celebration was involving this guy. That's my man, Juan Carlos, and his baby boy. JC's been on my team for about 7 years. JC moved to America from Guatemala. He does high-end motion graphics for a lot of our videos. He's unbelievably talented. JC has been slowly working his way through the US immigration process, which, as you know, has a few problems. Well, JC finally got the call a while back that he was receiving his green card, which, as you know, is a really big deal. Chris found out overnight he planned a party. JC came in the next morning to a huge red, white, and blue party. A lot of people complain about working for the man. Well, having done that exact thing for the last 11 years, I can actually report that working for the man is awesome, provided that the man is good. I cannot remember a Sunday night over the last 11 years where I didn't look forward to coming into the office the next day. We millennials get a bad rap for being flighty, but I think that's a total myth, and I think it's a leadership problem. Our millennials are very committed. We have millennials that have been around for 7, 9, 10 years. The reason for that is because outrageous care breeds outrageous loyalty. There is also a reciprocity in outrageous care because when the guy or the gal at the top chooses to lead this way, it cascades down the org chart, specifically to middle management, and they will automatically do the exact same thing. And when that happens, coworkers become friends. Love fills in all the cracks, and I'm convinced you cannot stop a company that is filled with people who genuinely love each other. It's an extremely powerful force. Now, some of you may be thinking, specifically the skeptics among us, that's all feel-good stuff, Brett. This is such a feel-good Plywood talk. But what about your actual business? Do you guys actually have a business, or you just sit around and celebrate all day? It's a good question. Since we started, we've grown at an average annual rate of 25%. We now have 500 team members. That's a lot of Applebee's booths. And we've helped raise $150 million for America's schools. December 31st is a very special date for me. It's the date that my dad died of the year 2000. This past year, on that day, I woke up, rolled over, heard my phone buzz, I grabbed it, and it was a text from Chris. And it said, "Hey buddy, thinking about you. Your dad would be really proud." Chris does this every single year. He always remembers. This is what I'm talking about with outrageous care. Doing spectacularly unexpected things to make people feel valued with the hope that when love fills their heart, you'll get the full version of them, and they'll give you 100% in everything that they do. Oscar Elsis died suddenly about 10 years after the strike. The Elsis family grave, it's a great big white marble mausoleum down at the old Oakland Cemetery. It towers over Memorial Drive. It's about a couple blocks from Cabbagetown. I can walk there from my loft. As I walk through Oscar's old cotton mill, I'm walking along timbers and stones laid by his men. I walk past his old office. So they put a tanning bed in there, which probably make him really mad. I walk through the streets of Cabbagetown past 100-year-old houses, and I arrive at his grave, and I just think and I ask myself, Brett, what will your leadership legacy be in the city of Atlanta? There are lots of bosses and future bosses in this room, and legacy is something we must all consider. I get that being a boss is hard sometimes. It's really hard, a lot of conflict, a lot of tension. But legacy is something we must consider. And when you do, consider that the most important decision you will ever make is the one where you decide how you will treat your people. Consider that sending home emotionally drained employees at the end of each day is bad for them, bad for their families, and bad for our city. Consider that building an organization where people can come fully alive is in and of itself an act of social good. Consider that the notion bosses shouldn't get too close to their employees is total garbage. Consider that better is possible, and consider the legacy you will lead if you choose to lead with outrageous care.